Good evening. This year on the 14th of May, we celebrated the 140th year of Girmit Remembrance, an integral part of Fijian history. Tonight we discuss Girmit Remembrance on the show, and joining us is Dr. Mohit Prasad, an academic and filmmaker on Girmit subjects, and Mr. Rajendra Prasad, who teaches linguistics and Hindi. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure to have you here, discussing a very important subject to us. Firstly, the start of the show, and this is a question to both of you. Firstly, Dr. Mohit, does Girmit history receive the recognition that it truly deserves in Fiji? Is there enough emphasis on it?
I think apart from a few recent initiatives to include it in the primary and high school curriculums, and I think that has been well received. Generally, it hasn't been included in the curriculum. We are approaching this is our 140th year. Yet we don't actually have any programs beyond those inclusions in the school curriculum. For example, none of our Fijian universities have any unit on what is actually a big discipline area in terms of plantation history of East Indian laborers, as it is called, for example, in the Caribbean. At the University of West Indies, which is a regional university, they actually have a full program on East Indian history. In East Indian history actually covers Girmit history. And that is also covered in universities in the United States, in Europe, even in England. So it's, I'm still not sure exactly why universities actually shy away from having, and I think that would be a real kickstarter in terms of getting Girmit history onto the right forum.
Mr. Prasad, do you agree?
I totally agree with Dr. Mohit that it has never got that recognition which it should have got. But fortunately now the discussions have entered public space and people are talking, and there's more and more desire for people to see that it is included in the school curriculum. Just this morning I was having a conversation with a university student who saw a bit of our program on Aina this week, and she was very surprised that these are some of the historical, reminiscence which we have not talked about. And she just shared with me that throughout her school days and even up to USP, because the unit that disciplines is in, she has never heard about linguistics. And coming to what Dr. Mohit said, it's a shame that the 3 universities in our country do not. And I think one of the underlying fact should be that Girmit does not belong to a particular community or a particular time and space. It is something which should be shared as a legacy which has shaped our country as it is today, and it has to be taken up by the entire population as a subject to be talked about.
And Dr. Mohit, at the risk of speculation, what are some possible reasons that you can imagine why we don't give enough emphasis, why we have historically not given such emphasis to Girmit history?
Part of it is the colonial legacy, in terms of we're still following a curriculum devised by Australians and New Zealanders. Our own curriculum, people really haven't got on board. They have done a few snatches of things. I think in the early 80s, maybe after the centennial celebrations of Girmit was a good time for inclusion. But they just went, and I think they included a few things like, for example, short stories and poems by local writers. But it did not extend to inclusion of Girmit. And I think after independence, the politics of Fiji has also dictated that, it should not be included into the curriculum. But for universities, it's a different ballgame. It just seems
exactly.
that whoever the historians were at various points of the University of the South Pacific, or more recently of FNU or UniFiji, they just don't seem to think that it is important enough. I think the blame also lies in terms of the university heads, especially vice chancellors, because they can take a lead role. My personal experience is this. Now that I'm an independent academic, and I can tell you this, my personal experience is that we have actually had a few vice chancellors who are from an Indo-Fijian background. And I feel that they have a cultural cringe in terms of promoting things that actually come from that legacy. Things like the history of Girmit, things like Fiji Hindi. So all those things actually accumulate and make up the reason why we are still not having this kind of inclusion.
Do you agree, Mr. Prasad? Who do you think should take a leading role in these sorts of matters?
Of course, as he said, the curriculum developers, we are still having this post-colonial hangover where we have never actually seen the curriculum from a local perspective. And again, I'll say that every time we talk of Girmit, it has always been tied to one particular community, the Indians of Fijian descent. It has been tied to that, and whenever we talked of higher education, normally people would think that Girmit should be tied up with Hindi studies, but people need to realize Girmit is a bigger thing. It encompasses the entire, and not the country, the region. Because if universities are serious about Girmit, they could start with diaspora studies. And there's a huge diaspora within Pacific itself to be discussed. Like before Girmitis, there were Vanuatus and Solomons coming to Fiji and working. And recently we talked about Laskars. These are the Indians who actually came and settled in Fiji much earlier than the Girmit era. And these are histories which are not talked about, and it is high time somebody thinks about it. And
right. Even as a student of the University of the South Pacific, and I was speaking to Dr. Mohit earlier, that there is a unit that's dedicated to Pacific history, that's Pacific Worlds. But from personal experience, and I could be wrong about this as well, Girmit history and blackbirding is taught as a sub-unit within one of the units in it. Do you think that's enough for students?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Do you think that just does justice to Girmit history?
No.
These are disciplines, even blackbirding and other migrant laborers who came to the Pacific, including Chinese and Japanese. And blackbirding actually is one of the big kind of topics right at the moment, because Australians have now begun to discover just how badly they're treated. Forced labor from the Solomon Islands, from Tanna in Vanuatu, and from the former Gilbert Islands and Tokelau. And, similarly, I think, when it comes to Girmit history, there is this kind of, it's almost like this kind of collective denial of that particular space.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that needs to change. That needs to change now. I think you look at when people talk about a country in terms of its present form, you talk about modern Fiji as it exists. And then the contributions of all these migrant groups who came over here, particularly of the Girmitis, is huge. In terms of even the roads we have now, the infrastructure that we have now. It may not be the best, but it was actually constructed, in fact, virtually by hand, by many of these people. And also, I think when we tend to do that, when you have this kind of collective denial, we also deny the place of the Itoke who actually worked as indentured laborers as well. Nobody actually knows that the CSR actually used to get Itoke in localized areas and indenture them in return for corrugated iron and timber to go back and build their houses. They did not get money. And nobody, when I talk about it, people are saying, which world are you coming from? And my response is that which world are you actually coming from? Because
this is the basic reality.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. We'll have more for you right after the break. So, Mr. Prasad, before the break, we were talking about where our history comes from.
Right, yeah.
So, let's continue the discussion in terms of the source of our history. We, of course, now know, as discussed in the last segment, that there isn't enough emphasis on Girmit history.
Exactly.
But as educators, you're in a position to know the current history that we have. Where does it come from?
The current history, of course, there were a lot of things written, especially by the colonials themselves. And we cannot just say all of them are false or fabricated. Most of them contain very factual elements. And somewhere along the time of independence and just post-independence, I think people started doubting all the things that were written. But if I go back and read history, like a book by Batten on Fiji Today in very late 1800s, and when I read that, the account of Girmit in that, and plus the blackbirding and other things, is so intense, so actual, and I'm thinking, why are we not using these things in mainstream today? So somewhere there was a disconnect. And this could be not, it was very emotive decision also at times, and not to blame anybody, but the leaders of the different communities at that time. It's like when you talk of Girmit today, people who might have no idea about Girmit, but just because they are in a leadership position, they assume I know everything. And they're not ready to actually listen to anybody. Like he said, they ask you, which world? I get that question every day. But yeah, what's wrong with you? What are you talking about? But this is the actual facts we have actually dug out from history. Yeah.
And it's interesting, there's always been this call, especially in recent times, that historical literature should be told from a Pacific viewpoint, from our own perspectives. Do you think that there's enough of that when it comes to Girmit historical literature?
Yes. I think, if you go back and look at most of the literature that exists from the early days, it comes out of the Australian National University,
Right.
who began to research here, and then they wrote it. And I think those texts are actually very much valuable, and I think we need to recognize the work that was done in those early days. But unfortunately, we don't actually have historians from our own communities, both from the Indo-Fijian and from the Itoge community. We have had a few starts, and then nobody actually continues with that. And that's very much an area of lack that we need to redress. At the same time, I think we need to also think of our ways of telling stories.
Right.
For example, including epistemologies in terms of how we rediscover our past. I think in Fiji, I always think that the use of media these days, responsible mainstream media, not social media, in fact, actually has been good, because all of a sudden we've got people who are actually telling stories again. We are rediscovering our myths and legends. We are talking about all that, and those programs are really good. But I think, in terms of formal education, again, it can be included in that as well. It's not always about classroom learning. It's also about taking students out of the classroom, putting them into the community, and finding out, in terms of your locality, what is the oral history of your locality. Do that first, and then we can look at the national thing.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree with him. And I think the disconnect began when the demise of the Girmitians happened, when the generation which was living in the 70s, they had the privilege of sitting with the people who actually lived Girmit. So they had a lot of oral history passed on to them. Then somewhere that oral history was not passed on to the younger generations. Like for today, us, we did not hear that from our fathers because our parents were not part of the Girmit era. So somewhere, as he said, that Pacific way of, especially the oral history, was not captured. So now what we have to do is go back. Those historians who did some work on Girmit during 70s, I in fact envy them, because they had the privilege of talking to the people who actually lived Girmit. We don't have that. So we have to go and dig in the archives. Yeah.
As someone who's done projects like, for example, you've made films on this subject, do you think that such mediums, for example, filmmaking, is a better way for people to learn history?
Yeah, I'm not really sure whether it's a better way. I think my fact that I've been an academic for so long means that I'm not going to go back and
could be a painful way
and go into intellectual bashing. Filmmaking is just another avenue. I've written poetry about the Girmit experience. I've written serious academic papers about the Girmit experience. I've presented and everything else. I just thought it was a natural step for me, given the amount of research I have done and the interesting stories that I had picked up. And that the new medium would actually take it to a wider audience and not just necessarily within academia itself. And I think that was important for me. That was important in terms of, like Rajan was just pointing out, in terms of the oral histories. I'm a bit older, so I actually listened to my great-grandmother, for example, and my maternal links are very strong in terms of the late Girmit history. So I had a whole lot of oral histories to rely on. I actually had a great-grandmother who actually spoke in English, and because she was working as a governess nanny at that time, and she shared all these stories, and both in Fiji Hindi, and then she would also be able to talk to us in English. So she was a valuable kind of repository of that kind of knowledge. So making films for me was actually a tribute to her, because most of the films that I've done is in relation to the stories that she has shared, and it goes back to the archives and getting things from there. As I was sharing with you earlier, one of the problems that we have is in terms of the enactment of Girmit. And I'm finding it more and more problematic. And as I get older, I'm just getting lot less, I have a lot less patience with enactments that are actually not authentic. Particularly when it comes to Girmit celebrations and events. All our Girmitia women are depicted as if they are widows.
Exactly.
They're all dressed in white. They're walking around and they're pretending to be old. When I was doing the films, I was criticized for actually having a young cast. For having color in my film. for having people who actually smiled during Girmit. And I think, it goes back to this misconception, this kind of stereotyping and very, very bad stereotyping, internal stereotyping, that we need to have Girmitis who are old, that they walk with a stoop or a cane. In fact, that image actually comes from much later, when Girmit had long gone away, when the last of the Girmitis were there. And now we need to teach our people who are performance groups and others that you actually go back and try and depict them, because more than 90% of all the Girmitis who came, the 60,553, more than 90% were under the age of 20.
Exactly.
Because as we were discussing, history is often seen as something that's very contextual. It doesn't stand on itself. And in fact, this is something that the way that we receive our history is something that I'd like to dedicate an entire segment to. So we'll have that right after the break. So carrying on from where we left off in the last segment, much of the highlighted history that we often remember about Girmitis involves the struggle of the Girmit laborers and the hardships that they faced. In your opinion, Mr. Prasad and Dr. Mohit, are there parts of this history that should be emphasized more? Are there things that we tend to overlook when we look at Girmitiya history?
I'll just pick up from where Dr. Mohit left, the way the Girmit celebrations are being done now. In fact, I also shy away from it a bit. I want to stay away because the way it is depicted, as he said, everybody's crying, everybody's being beaten up, but that's not Girmit. That's just one tiny segment of Girmit. Girmit is a huge thing, and if you look at his movies, what he has decided to do, look at particular segments of Girmit which needs celebration. There were songs, there were dances where women used to really wear jewelry, and men used to come home and actually relax after a long day of work. And they would indulge in a bit of smoking and drinking grog and actually having a little bit of song and other things. So those things need to be told also, and it's not always that Girmit is all doom and gloom. And the way they celebrated, like every time the Indians are depicted as very poor people. But who was rich at that time?
Right.
Right? It was the richness was in life itself. They loved life. So it needs to be understood. And the word Girmit itself has been just used so many ways that people believe Girmit is certainly an object now. They have objectified it. Whereas it is much more than that. In fact, I was reading a paper by Professor Sudesh Mishra, how the word Girmit, from being a noun, was actually verbalized. It became a verb for the Girmitians. And when people say it's recently I saw somebody saying in one of his speeches, it's a corruption of the word agreement. I totally disagree with that. The word corruption is a very strong word. When languages borrow each other's word, there is a lot of changes linguistically. So it's not actually a corruption. And if you look at it from a perspective of the Girmitians, we look at Girmit as an agreement, a bound thing. But the Girmitians, the Indians at that time, were actually celebrating the bound from unbound. They were actually unbound, and they were celebrating a kind of freedom within an agreement. So it's not about doom and gloom, it's a lot of celebration also.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because when you look at Girmit, and I think just to emphasize something, Girmit is not a term that's restricted to Fiji.
Yeah.
So Girmit is a common term amongst all the British colonies that actually took indentured laborers. In fact, May is regarded as the month of Girmitiya arrivals across what eventually came to be known as the sugar plantations of the British colonies. And so in Trinidad, for example, on May 30th, they'll be celebrating their arrival day. In Suriname, in Mauritius, in other places. So they're all celebrating in very, very similar fashion to what we are doing. And again, in terms of how we celebrate, I think we need to really rethink that. We can't be celebrating in terms of a reaction to a particular date.
Right.
It has to be for a longer period. It has to be more sustainable in terms of the inclusion of various things. Going back to the idea of performance, in fact, the oral tradition, again, it goes back to the construct of folk songs. In fact, historians agree that the only reliable and communal testimony of Girmit actually comes through folk songs. So the folk songs, for example, Abhidesya will tell you what was happening on the plantations. The form like a pachra, for example, will actually include things that goes even further, that it becomes very political in terms of, for example, one of the famous pachras actually is constructed on a ship, where the crew actually were trying to warn the others in terms of the movements of the captain. So there are all kinds of agency within the folk tradition that we need to celebrate. And I don't think we should be doing it in terms of depictions.
Right.
I think the true Girmit legacy in terms of the folk tradition comes in terms of the folk performers in Fiji. And these individuals, these families in fact, and these groups have actually existed on their own volition. They don't have academies. Governments generally have not looked after them. They're not included in UNESCO discussions on heritage in terms of tangible and non-tangible assets. But they still sustain themselves. And they do that very, very proudly. I work with a lot of them. When I was doing the films, when I started doing the films, I realized that I could not rely on soundtracks from Bollywood.
Definitely,
So I actually had a Solomon Island composer with me. So we traveled and we worked with Kelvin Rory from USP. And we traveled and we worked with the folk groups. And he was amazed at the kind of variety that exists and the familial kind of history within them. And I think, and also the musicians themselves. And many of them are, working on the farms. They'll be working as FSC workers and then, or taxi drivers. And then in the evenings they'll get back and then they perform. And just added on to that, I think the transference of the folk traditions to the Itoke community has also been great. One of the performers that I've worked with is Noah Jr. from Lautoka. You almost have to try and book an appointment to see him. He's so busy.
So busy.
And he's from Perinkoro in Lambasa. And there are quite a few of them who are from that particular area. And the demand for them is so great, they actually get taken over overseas, to go and perform and to keep the tradition going in terms of that.
This transference of folk tradition to the current generation, the youths especially, do you see a lot of that in Fijians of Indian descent, that transference?
There is, but of course some, if he will agree with me, the elements are being lost. There's some kind of...
Is there a tendency to shy away from Girmit?
Because I'm actively working with people on the ground. And not from what I can see. For example, I'll go to Deepwater in Talebu. I'll sit with Subramani Kowal. And when I go to his house, the gathering is always in terms of the first generation, Subramani, and then his sons and his nephews and everybody else, and then the grandchildren, everybody comes in there. And the amazing thing about them, they'll be performing, and then you'll find that somebody moves away, and then a little girl will walk in and she takes over. So that thing is very much alive, that tradition is alive.
So the transition happens.
Is there. And I think it's particularly strong in the rural areas, and especially in the north, in Lambasa. I think it's very, very strong there. And I think, I'm very appreciative of the fact, especially when I go to Lambasa. For example, we had a Girmit event over there. All the other Girmit events were for a couple of hours. In Lambasa, it went for 8 hours.
Wow. Yeah. That's really something.
So I think that shows that kind of thing. And I think we need to keep on encouraging them and also sustaining them in tangible ways. And I think, out of all these celebrations that we are talking about, if there's one thing that we want to have a takeaway for in terms of the future is to encourage, to provide incentives for these groups so that they can continue with this very, very specialized, very, very much a Fijian traditional legacy. It's not something that you can find in Trinidad. Trinidad has got their own forms. In Mauritius, they have their own forms. We come from a particular, in terms of our origins in India, but how we actually do that is quite different.
Right.
That is what I have always said. The Fiji Girmitia situation has transformed into something totally unique. The fusion between the two major racial groups and the way we have taken this Girmit, this whole journey is totally different from Mauritius and other places, and that makes us unique, something to celebrate. And just to add on to that, normally when we see celebrations today, it is confined to one particular racial group.
Right.
We should not, because the other group played a very important role in the lives of Girmitians and actually in the continuation till today. Yeah.
And in fact, we'll discuss more on that subject right after the break. Gentlemen, earlier this week during the Girmit celebrations, our Honourable Prime Minister encouraged people to take the time to read Girmit's stories, saying that they're an important lesson in strength and perseverance. And he also spoke about how many Girmitian first-hand accounts speak about the unity at that time between indigenous Fijians and the Girmitians. So for someone who may not be aware of this, tell us about some of this history.
Okay, I think right from the beginning, I think there was a kind of curiosity about each other. You've got a new people in a new landscape, and the Itoke were curious about them. In fact, when the Leonidas arrives in Levuka on 14th of May, 1879, the governor, because of fears of an epidemic, because of disease on board Leonidas, made a very firm decision. He had shoot to kill orders to prevent the Itoke from going out, because they were kept on the ship, and then they were transported to Yenuda Lalai, which is a very small island near Moturiki. And in order to prevent the kind of spread of epidemic, they actually had that order, and they followed it in terms of making sure that everybody knew about it. So that was the introduction, and it's quite a in terms of it's quite a stern kind of introduction.
Right.
But from there on, I think once people started to move, and I think back to the Leonidas story, a few of them ended up in Levuka. About 100 of them went to Rabi Island. Rest of them actually came and worked here in Suva,
In Rewa.
in building Suva and building the capital. The soon to be proclaimed capital of Fiji.
Yeah.
So between 1879 and 1880, they were here in Suva. And that particular group, I'm actually doing some studies on them in terms of there's a project that's we're working on in terms of histories of Suva. And, that particular group was actually settled where, just behind Albert Park, going up towards the hill. And there were settlements there in terms of Itoke settlements and from the K. Solomoni settlements from the Blackbird era. So that particular group was quite interesting because they had a lot of interaction with each other because they were not on a plantation. They were basically municipal workers. They were actually public works department workers. So that beginning is not something that people are not aware of.
Exactly.
And I think that was a case where these people will eventually move to Nosori to work in the CSR mill there, and they finished off the last 7 years there. But moving on to that, after that in the 1880s, one of the few accounts that we have of Girmit is that of Benarsidas Chaturvedi's transcribing of the life of Totaram Sanadia, my 21 years in Fiji. And he actually devotes a lot of the time in terms of describing interactions between the Itoke and the people in the lines up in Wenbakasi, around that particular area. Sanadia himself actually learned the Rewa dialect. And he actually promoted the idea of learning the language as a means of understanding each other. And one of the most moving accounts that you'll find is in his book when he spends all his ration. He gets a few people over, they have a small sit down and they finish off all the food. And you don't get rations for the rest of the week, no matter what. So basically, after 3 days, he's basically starving. He's still working a full day, comes back and there's no food in the house. And then 4 Itoke men walk into the house and walk into his line, and they want some food. And he says, I don't have any food. And then one of them goes and looks into a pot and finds some rice in it, some leftover rice that he had not seen. And he quite happily eats it. And just before these 4 men had arrived, he had actually picked up a rope and he was going to commit suicide. And then this man had actually, they were very perceptive. So one of them had actually seen the rope. And then they walked out and one of them stayed with it. So the other 3 went out and then they got root crops and bananas and other things and brought it back and shared a meal. And at the end of that particular interaction between them, one of the men actually picks up the rope, ties it around his waist and says, I'm going to use it to tie up my boat. And then they walk out. I think that's a brilliant kind of depiction of the interaction that took place. This is in the 1880s. So that sort of continues. You also have to remember that the Girmitians, most of them completed 10 years. They didn't go back after 5 years because they had to pay their own way. So after 10 years they were here. A lot of them went into what we now know as Vakavanu arrangements in terms of leasing land. And then they relied on the Itoke to help build, and most of the early houses that they had were bures. So they built bures and that became the farmhouse. And that remained there for the next 70 years or so. So that is the beginning of that. The other interesting point, and Rajan also, we've talked about this because we used it in the film, is Kava, Yangona,
Yeah.
and Nangona, as it is known.
The language
And
those
the
things.
use of that, and how it became, a replacement for bhang.
Bhang from India.
Okay.
Or ganja, is it? It's called ganja because
Ganja,
marijuana is brought down as seeds down the Ganges. So as a
Okay.
code word, they use ganja.
Ganja.
So that's what it is known as. So when they brought it over here, they were still using it, but then they discovered kava, and that became the new bhang for them.
And as I said, after that hard days of work, they need to relax.
Right.
So what the whole world is advertising today, that kava is used as an antidepressant or they were using it then, actually. And that actually, what he talked about, the Sanand Hayes story. Remember when he came in Girmit, he was just 17 years old. As we said, most of the young people came. He was just 17 years old, and he was the first guy to learn Fijian. And if you go back and look at some of the education reports, the Education Commission of 1800s, then one in 1926, what people are crying about today for conversational Fijian, do you know, it was recommended at that time that the two communities should learn each other's language. So it is nothing new. And that time it was the colonials opposing it. Today, unfortunately, it is our own people opposing it.
Right.
The colonial hangover has not been shaken off. Yeah. So yeah.
So one of the famous songs, one of the famous folk songs that was composed from very very early on days, actually talks about how they have left their motherland, their fatherland, but they're not worried because they've got kava.
They've got kava.
They've got Yamona, they've got Nangona, and that will be the substitute for their beloved they have left behind, the children,
So they were happy people.
the social network, everything they have left behind. They were not always happy, but I think the point is that that kind of influence,
And,
creation of identity. So it becomes very much a Fijian identity that gets taken on.
the acceptance, as I say, they accepted this is the way of life. As I was telling you the last day, when the word behal, if you say behal in standard Hindi, it means you are in an emergency situation. You are about to die. But today you say behal, that means great. So their situation was some kind of emergency. They were beaten, blue and black, but they got so used to it. Behal became a word with a lot of positive connotations. So they actually reorganized their life. They came with, as I said, the word Girmit. They signed an agreement for all good things. As I'll quote what Mishra has quoted Sanandhya, the Akriti is the recruiters. The Akriti explained things to the people there in the halfway house. Look, brothers, the place where you will walk, you will never have to suffer any sorrows. There will never be any kind of problems there. You will eat a lot of bananas and a stomach full of sugar cane and play flutes and relaxation. That was the promise given. Of course, everything was out of, obviously total to that, and what we say, the paradox of life. But the beauty is they accepted that reality and navigated around it, yes, rather than crying and, always complaining.
This is such an interesting conversation. We'll have more for you in the final segment when we come back from a break. So in the final segment, let's talk about some legacies that we can see very visibly in our current life in Fiji. When we spoke about that unity between indigenous Fijians and Girmitians, why more than now, why more than ever now, why is it important for us to remember that aspect of our history?
I alluded to the question of language. Now, that is something which is a unifying factor. We cannot deny that. And if you read the historical aspects of language development and other things, now today if you go to the market, any person selling vegetables will be calling out the names in Hindi, choriya, baigan. The point is, this developed not overnight, but it started, what we call the pidgin Fiji, Hindi, started when the Tamils came here in 1903 and so onwards. They could not speak the version of Hindi or the variety of Hindi spoken, so they picked up things, and they actually used a lot of verbs with a lot of imperatives. When I say imperatives, all the verbs ending with O. Now that is something very unique for Fiji Hindi. It's only language in the entire world which has so much imperative endings. And who actually, the South Indians started it, but today, our Ituke brothers will always say, Beni Beitu. Yeah, things like that. It's with a O. So that kind of language, legacy, which supersedes race and everything else, is the gelling factor. And I think we need that more than ever today.
I think, obviously this legacy comes out of a particular idea of empire or colonialism, where you have a division of people as one of the instruments of rule. And it was very much in terms of institution that creates that kind of division, keeps the kind of divisions. So things like, even sports, for example, so you had an Indian league, you had a native league, and you had a European league. So even sports like rugby, for example, or cricket, or soccer. And all these things were designed to keep people apart for so many years. So after 1970, one of the things that happened after independence was the recognition of a new nation, the birth of a new nation. And if you look at the speeches that Ratu Mara made, Siddiq Koya made, you'll find that they actually harnessed that kind of energy around them. Unfortunately, it did not last very long. Very, very quickly you had a kind of division that took place. And then you have the elections that have taken place since then, and then the coups that have taken place. You find this kind of denial that you have a nation. And when you have this kind of divided kind of sense of nation, and the continuity comes from within, then it becomes even more dangerous. And it becomes something that actually brings everybody down. If somebody says that the 1987 coup was in the interest of the Itoke, when you really look at the economics of that particular coup, you'll realize that nobody actually gained from that,
benefited,
except for a few people who sent flowers to their mistresses across the island because they became ministers and the rest of that. I used to work in magazines at that time, and there's a bigger story there. But I mean, those kind of things. So when you go back and forth in terms of now politics actually enters the arena. And then you look forward in terms of the Girmit legacy. And one of the strong points, of course, is that it come up with the idea of work ethics, for example, or being productive, of actually understanding that there is an agency that tries to divide people, but actually trying to overcome that in your everyday space. And then it becomes, a lot more crucial for us to look back at it and say, okay, hey, these guys were onto something at that particular point in time. They actually did a lot of things despite all the odds being stacked against them. So now when we have opportunities to actually, coexist and actually to move forward, and that this doesn't need to be done without questioning things. It doesn't need to be done in an atmosphere where everybody agrees and everything. You have robust discussions. You have robust disagreements.
We have to agree to disagree.
Yeah. But at the end of it, you have to realize that, if you're going to be sinking or trying to sink one group, you're going to be sinking Fiji.
Yeah, we'll all sink together. So we need to fix things. And as he said, the sports especially was so divided according to race. But what has happened since 1970 till today? The common people have found ways to break all barriers. The sports scene has today broken all barriers.
Right.
There's no question of race anymore. Be it spectators or players. There's no question of race. So if common people can do that, why can't people who hold powers do that? And again, as he says, we will agree to disagree, but for the entire progress of the nation. And what happened in 87, it took almost one generation to realize, hey, what happened was not right. We cannot follow people blindly. So now we learn from history, and 97 is also history. Right? We might not realize that, but history can be very short and very long, but the short history can have a very strong effect on what we do today and tomorrow. So we have learned our lesson. Can we now move forward as a progressive nation? And that is where again I come back to the celebration of Girmit. Please don't confine it to one race, to one ethnicity. And you will realize, we were on air the other day and there was a caller. There's a big misconception about ethnicity and nationality. They are two big things. We are all of one nationality, agree, but we cannot refuse to say there's ethnicity, there's different ethnic groups, but all unite to be one national, to have one nationality.
Right. And while we're getting towards the end of the show, we spoke a little about Fiji Hindi.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat of a controversial issue, especially
yeah.
for someone who works in Hindi radio. A lot of people, when they hear us speak in Fiji Hindi, it irks them.
Oh, tell me about it.
So if someone is making a speech in Hindi, it
Yeah.
should be Indian Hindi
Right.
and not Fijian Hindi, or
Okay.
Fiji Hindi as we call it. Why do you think that is? Why is that?
One of the great linguists, Crystal, says one thing in his linguistic encyclopedia. When you talk of science and rockets, they are specialists, and people will listen to them. When you talk of linguistics, everybody is a specialist, right? Nobody will listen to each other. This whole idea of first of all, I plead to the people, because I'm a person who talks about Fiji Hindi, but on the other hand, I also teach Standard Hindi in university. I do programs in Standard Hindi. So there's no kind of conflict between the two. They support each other. Remember, the day Fiji Hindi dies, Standard Hindi will disappear. Standard Fiji Hindi is actually providing scaffolding. The students, when they come to school, actually have a basic working knowledge of Hindi. And we just correct grammar and other things.
Right.
And of course, vocabulary is our choice. Language is dynamic. The amount of English words where people are complaining Fiji Hindi uses a lot of English borrowings. Have you listened to the Hindi in India? How many listen to Bollywood?
Right.
Language is dynamic. What people say Fiji Hindi is a corrupted language, but don't forget, until 1970s, you will agree, in Europe, in England, English was supposed to be a corrupted language. People were taught in Latin, right? So this kind of judgment about language has always been there, and will always be there. English is actually seen as a bastardized language till one time, until it became. Till 17, some schools would prefer teaching in Latin and not that.
Right.
So my idea is, please, if you have not understood the concept, and many people go back to the 2013 constitution and say Fiji Hindi is replacing Hindi. No, that's not it. Please go, the constitution is available widely, read it. It says compulsory vernacular, conversational Hindi and conversational Fijian. The paper, for my understanding of the constitution is this: in primary school, the Indians learn Fijian and the Fijians learn Fiji Hindi as a conversational language. I don't see anywhere saying to be replaced or replacing Hindi. Hindi is a subject on its own.
And just finishing off, this talk about language, it also the underlying theory is taking ownership of your own identity, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the Girmitias. Let's go back to the Girmitias.
Right.
After they finished the 10 year, most of them, they committed and they stayed on in Fiji. Those who left after 5 years, they left. So about 30% of all of those who came left. The remaining 70% actually committed to being in Fiji.
Exactly.
They accepted Lord Salisbury's dictate that that you are going to be equal citizens, and they actually stayed on, and then they made a commitment to the place. They quickly discovered education, and they transformed their own society in terms of using education as a means of progressing, also as a means of leverage. I think that kind of identity that comes out of the Girmit legacy also needs to be recognized. That is not something that people are just going to do in terms of any kind of artificial imposition.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Gentlemen, this has been such an interesting discussion, and I'm sure you agree, or I wish we had more time.
Definitely.
Because it's such a big issue, isn't
Yeah.
it? So I certainly
Yeah.
hope to have you back sometime on the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
inviting.
And that's all we have on the show tonight. Do join us again next week. Good evening.